Okay, so now we're going to go through Auden's Unknown Citizen. So in this poem, what we'll see is that Auden deliberately critiques the bureaucracy and especially their desire for complete control, which ultimately really threatens the individual's freedom and subjugates them. So I think this is quite a good poem to pick up on because it really does issue a warning of the state's capacity to invade the private realm. And he really highlights, or he really represents, how the public sector can overpower or oppress the individual. So let's start off by actually discussing the form he uses. So in terms of the narrative voice, especially through the title and the use of rhyming couplets, he creates a really light-hearted tone. And he also does create like a satirical representation of the sacrifice of soldiers for the state, and this ultimately alludes to the ideal citizen who similarly will relinquish all of their rights and their identity for the good of the state. We also have the narration from a government perspective, and this really generates a sense of omnipotence, and I guess that is Auden's way of representing the forced installation of public values upon the individual through, these intrusive surveillance methods of private life. So already through, the title, the rhyming couplets, the narrative voice he uses, we can see this representation of the way in which the government's political motivation for control will be quite invasive on the individual and their private realm. So within the opening of the poem, he has an inscription where he chooses the initials JS, which imply John Smith, and this allows his poem to be symbolic of the everyman. And I guess also something interesting to look at is that the statistical representation of personal facts, it still doesn't provide any insight into the citizen's true identity. And I think this is a really interesting representation of the unanimity of public opinion, which is established through enforced conformity to like a centralized authority, which in this case is the government. On top of that, in terms of representing how the government's desire for control will lead to invasive methods of surveillance, we see this accumulation of different government groups. So we've got the Bureau of Statistics, Union Reports, and health cards. And ultimately what this does is this represents how the surveillance, how the ultimate goal of the political groups is to maintain power. And this is done through surveilling the individual. Okay, so that just gives you a quick overview of the way in which political motivations of control can be achieved, especially in terms of unknown citizen. And now we can actually look at the impact this has on the individual. So when we see here that that individual that's being surveyed believed that when there was peace, he was for peace, and then when there was war, he went. So there's the use of caesura within this line, and this really disrupts the regular rhythm which is achieved by single syllable words, and so it reveals the shifting opinions of the shifting of the individual's opinion in order to align with the expectations of the political group in power, the government. So Auden, in this way, he represents the power relationship between the individuals and the dominant political groups, and he really represents how these groups have the capacity to really degenerate any sense of liberty or unique identity that the individual may hold. Moreover, he uses a metaphorical reference when he says that that individual was a saint, for in everything he did, he served the greater community. So the deliberate, first off, I think it's really interesting how Auden deliberately capitalizes greater community, and I think that highlights the bureaucratic view that compliance is the ultimate virtue. And I also think he's really effectively used this metaphor of saying he was a saint in order to highlight how happy the state is to have an individual that will completely conform to them. And what you'll also see actually is there is a fair bit of biblical imagery where I think he depicts someone dying on the cross or something similar to that. And basically what this indicates is that the individual is ultimately sacrificing their freedom for the good of the state. And then the last line of the poem he uses is actually really powerful because it says, was he free? Was he happy? The question is absurd, right? So it plays into the whole satirical tone that Auden has created throughout his poem. And what this does is it really represents Auden's view that the bureaucracy had little consideration for the core needs of the individual, right? And those core needs are represented as freedom or happiness. And the deliberate use of rhetorical question, which is quickly cut off by the truncated sentence, really exemplifies the extent, and it mimics the extent to which the individual is compromised by the state and how the state imposes its own values and its own ideals upon the individual and ultimately subjugates them. So within Unknown Citizen, what you can see is that there's a very clear political motivation for control over the individual, and that is from the start shown through the narrative voice, as well as the accumulation of the different organizations which monitor the individual. And then you can really flesh out the impacts of that by highlighting how the individual is left with absolutely no freedom and no self-autonomy. Okay, so that's just an overview of Unknown Citizen.